Dachau, late winter 1943. Allied forces would not discover the truth until years later. But behind the walls of this facility, a different kind of battle was being fought. Not with tanks, not with rifles, but with temperature. Inside a sealed laboratory chamber, a pressure gauge trembled as icy air poured into the room. Frost formed on metal pipes, turning the room into a man-made winter. Scientists watched closely, clipboards in hand, as their subjects struggled to remain conscious. Official documents called it hypothermia research. The stated goal was simple: improve survival of soldiers in freezing seas. But eyewitness accounts, surviving files, and testimony from post-war trials paint a far more chilling picture. Dozens of individuals, exposed to near-freezing water or air, monitored second by second as their bodies shut down. Why were they pushed past human limits? Who approved the trials? And what did these doctors hope to learn or prove before the war ended? Most of all, why were these files hidden for decades? Tonight, we open the archive door. The temperature drops, and a forgotten chapter of science is revealed. Before the outside world understood what was happening behind sealed doors, another battlefield was already being drawn across Europe. It wasn't fought with infantry, nor tanks, nor aircraft. It was drawn in ink, on blueprints, on research directives, on military budgets. The Nazi regime believed the future belonged not to the strongest army, but to the nation with the most advanced science. Hitler's ministers used a single word over and over again: Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons. To build them, entire academic systems were re-engineered. Universities were quietly stripped of their most talented minds. Professors vanished into government contracts. Promising students were redirected to facilities buried beneath mountains, where windows were optional and silence was mandatory. Funding shifted from civilian medicine to military physiology, aviation biology, chemical enhancement, survival science. Laboratories became war rooms. By 1941, submarine warfare choked the Atlantic. German pilots who crashed into freezing water lived only minutes before the bodies surrendered to the cold. The High Command demanded answers. How long could a pilot survive in icy seas? Could hypothermia be delayed? Could the body be revived afterward? Could the brain remain functional? Instead of simulation, leadership chose the simplest path. They would test it on real human beings. Dachau, one of the earliest and largest camps, had become the perfect testing ground. Here a physician did not fear lawsuits or ethics boards. Here a scientist could push a chamber 2 degrees colder, raise air pressure 1 more notch, hold oxygen away 1 minute longer. If a subject collapsed, another number was assigned. Clipboards replaced identities, corridors filled with the echo of machinery. Thermometers dipped, body temperatures were recorded with clinical precision. Some researchers spoke softly to their subjects. Others treated them like equipment. But nearly all agreed on one thing. The data was priceless for the war effort. The state rewarded them for it. Promotions, funding, bigger chambers. More advanced instruments shipped in plain wooden crates. The culture of research changed. At first, the goal was survival. Rescue pilots faster, prevent frostbite, rewarm the heart. But when results proved promising, the questions shifted quietly. How did the organs respond when the body was pushed past its limit? How quickly did the heartbeat fail? Could the brain record the moment consciousness slipped away? Medical notes were signed, stamped, and sealed inside files labeled Heimatkriegswichtig, vital to the homeland's war. Their findings, impossible to obtain ethically, were copied directly to military offices, and no one outside those walls ever knew. The deeper the war dragged, the more frantic the science became. New devices arrived: pressure simulators, altitude chambers, oxygen deprivation rigs. Engineers walked the same halls as doctors. Clipboards brushed against polished boots. The line between medicine and machinery thinned until both served the same purpose. Patients, or rather subjects, were no longer told anything. They were escorted silently into rooms lit by cold bulbs. Instruments hummed. Frost collected on steel. Researchers monitored dials as if watching the weather, not a life ebbing away. The notebooks were immense. Columns of temperatures, heart rates, recovery times, behavioral notes, responses to shock, responses to rewarming, Responses when rewarming failed. In the margins, someone had written a single phrase, Grenzen der Belastbarkeit, the limits of endurance. But those limits did not belong to the researchers. They belonged to the people strapped to the tables. While the front lines froze and buckled in the east, the science behind those sealed doors grew sharper. The government's directives grew colder. Data became currency. The question became not how to protect life, but how far it could be pushed before it ended. Some scientists believed they were saving thousands of pilots. Others admitted quietly, in the privacy of their diaries, that they were no longer certain what they were serving. Patriotism, ambition, fear, curiosity, all four blended into something dangerous. As months passed, the laboratories expanded deeper underground. New chambers were added, not just for cold but for pressure, altitude, and chemical exposure. Engineers calibrated gauges, while physicians recorded responses with steady hands. No one asked permission. No one refused orders. And as the machinery grew louder, another realization settled quietly into the halls. If the body could be broken, it could also reveal secrets. Secrets about resilience. Secrets about pain. Secrets about recovery. And once those secrets surfaced, the next logical question was inevitable. What else could be learned if the body was pushed further still? The cold exposure trials at Dachau were built on a seemingly straightforward military theory. If the human body could be cooled until vital functions slowed, then rewarmed in controlled conditions, Allied rescue crews might recover airmen who crashed into freezing seas. It was a logic framed in the language of survival. But the regime possessed something no civilian hospital would ever allow: access to an endless pool of test subjects who could be monitored, measured and replaced without questions. Inside the cold chambers, the air felt metallic. Thermometers hung from steel beams, their glass vials trembling as temperatures fell by degrees. Subjects were brought in quietly, often without warning, and secured in standing frames or lowered into water tanks chilled to near ice. A physician in a black coat would stand behind a clipboard, eyes fixed on the heartbeat monitor. Assistants adjusted valves, watched frost form on eyebrows, recorded the slowing cadence of speech. Every reaction was data, shivering intensity, changes in pulse rhythm, reflex loss, the exact moment the body could no longer generate heat. Even simple behaviors, how long someone remained conscious or able to respond, were charted with ruler straight lines on paper. Initially, the objective was clinical, to determine whether warm blankets or heated baths revived faster, whether friction applied to limbs restored circulation, whether sudden heat could shock the heart back to rhythm. Researchers timed recovery attempts down to the second. They compared different methods: immersion in warm water, radiant heat, and controlled airflow. They measured cranial temperature with meticulous precision. But as weeks turned into months, something began to shift. Reports from international investigators would later suggest that many sessions pushed beyond safe thresholds, not to rescue, but to observe decline. As internal temperatures dropped dangerously low, subjects drifted into confusion, speaking in fragmented phrases, sometimes pleading to stay awake. Assistants noted these changes with calm detachment. Clipboards filled with numbers. Graphs dipped downward. The mechanical hum of refrigeration continued. There were attempts at revival, but they often came too late. Warm water baths that were supposed to restore breathing were sometimes applied after the body was already in critical collapse. Other times, recovery techniques were tested repeatedly on weakened subjects, not to save them, but to compare outcomes. Each result was described clinically: delayed response, irreversible failure, no recovery, and the equipment grew more specialized. Sensors were placed along the spine. Electrocardiographs recorded the fading heartbeat. Rectal probes monitored core temperature, while physicians watched for any correlation between consciousness and internal cold. At one point, warming by animal body heat was even noted, as researchers compared natural thermal transfer to artificial methods. During post-war interrogations, many of the scientists insisted they were objective observers. They argued they were serving national interest, gathering data that would save pilots. Yet international tribunals pointed out that medical literature already documented hypothermia effects. Animal studies existed. Simulated immersion trials could have been conducted more safely. So why continue in this direction? The answer was embedded in the wartime mindset. Urgency overruled caution. Secrecy erased accountability. Inside a classified chamber, the line between necessary research and abusive methodology dissolved. Each extreme result generated new curiosity. What happened at a slightly lower temperature? What if the subject was exhausted first? Could the brain recover speech after deeper cooling? The human body became a variable, not a person. Those who survived described an eerie silence in the chambers. The only sounds were the ticking of thermometers, the scribbling of pencils, the soft hiss of air from valves. Many lost feeling in fingers first, then feet, then legs. Eventually, speech slowed until only faint whispers remained. Observers recorded the moment when eyes ceased to track movement. Meanwhile, the data flowed upward, through classified channels. Reports were signed, stamped, and forwarded to military medical offices. Some recommendations were implemented for Luftwaffe rescue squads, with instructions on how to revive downed pilots faster. Officially, the research was successful. Privately, it revealed a darker truth. The more the state desired results, the easier it became to ignore how those results were obtained. Ethical language was replaced by technical terminology. Suffering became reaction time. Collapse became endpoint. Death was described as lack of recovery. By the time liberation forces discovered the files, hundreds of entries showed precise internal measurements taken at extreme conditions. Investigators stared at data impossible to obtain ethically, yet scientifically valuable. Some medical communities debated whether the information should be used. The discussion itself proved how far the experiments had gone. The chilling fact remained. Science was no longer guided by healing, but by the endless pursuit of limits. The colder the chamber, the greater the curiosity. Every downward tick on a thermometer promised another insight. And as the war escalated, so did the scope of experimentation. Cold exposure led to altitude trials, oxygen deprivation chambers, chemical endurance tests, and pressure simulations, all justified by military necessity. Behind locked steel doors, curiosity had become a tool without boundaries. In these rooms, the machinery hummed, frost collected on metal pipes, and clipboards filled with numbers. But missing from every page was the most important measurement of all, the cost to the human soul, because once a state prioritizes outcomes over ethics, the human body becomes just another machine to be tested, and in the laboratories of Dachau, the machinery was only getting louder. For decades, sensational documentaries have obsessed over one rumored Nazi device, Die Glocke, the bell, a supposed machine capable of bending physics. But unlike that myth, the cold exposure experiments at Dachau are not whispered conspiracy. They are carved into archived paperwork, tribunal testimony, and survivor accounts. Their existence is undeniable. The real mystery is intent. When Allied intelligence teams opened sealed storage rooms and cracked frozen cabinets, they expected to find data strictly about survival time in icy waters. And they did. Neatly drawn hospital curves, body temperature charts, and heart rate decay patterns. But the further investigators read, the more anomalies appeared. Some charts tracked brain response under extreme cold, not just physical survival. Handwriting at the margins noted altered perception, impaired speech, fragmented memory. Others measured electrical activity on muscles, reflex delay, and cognitive processing. None of these matched the official goal of air-sea rescue. Why would aviation medics need to know how cold alters consciousness? Buried in one folder, examiners found references to frische Versuchsräume, fresh test rooms, a designation never found in surviving blueprints. The lines that followed abruptly ended mid-sentence, as if the page had been removed mid-thought. Staple holes indicated at least 3 missing sheets. Another report described controlled thermal shock using devices not listed in procurement logs. These devices appear only once. Their serial numbers are unknown. The document that should explain them was torn from its binder. When Allied investigators toured the physical laboratories, they noticed something stranger still. Whole shelves were dust clean, the ghost imprint of missing folders visible. Cabinets were locked but empty. Electrical outlets had scorch marks. Tools were missing. Instruments that should have been bolted down were simply gone, which raises a question no tribunal answered. Who removed them? War was ending. Chaos ruled, yet someone found the time to unbolt machines, clean storage drawers, and extract only certain files. Not all, just the elusive ones. Interrogated personnel claimed ignorance. Some insisted they were reassigned. Others used a chilling phrase, "not authorized." And beyond reassignment lay something darker. Several doctors who held key roles in the trials never appeared at their registered addresses after the war. Their passports were blank. No burial record, no factory job, no testimony, just silence. Historians argue they were spirited into other programs, shielded by nations hungry for wartime medical knowledge. Because while tribunals condemned the experiments publicly, privately, intelligence agencies were curious. Hypothermia kills soldiers on every front. Cold shock disables pilots, sailors, commandos. Knowledge, even unethical knowledge, has value. In the late 1940s, encrypted memos circulated through Allied research laboratories discussing rapid rewarming protocol, nearly identical to procedures trialed in Dachau. Someone had access to those results. Someone used them. Yet when modern researchers request full access to these archives, they are often told the same phrase, "still classified." But why classify medical revival data from 80 years ago? Some experts propose another layer. They argue that late war testing shifted focus, not to survival but to resuscitation. Can a human, cooled nearly to biological shutdown, be brought back? How long could brain activity suspend before irreversible damage? If successful, such knowledge could rewrite battlefield medicine. It would be miracle weapon science, Wunderwaffe biology, life extended. Death delayed. Others theorize these experiments flirted with something unintentionally revealing, that consciousness degrades in predictable stages. Memory fractures. Identity loosens. A chilling phrase appears on one surviving slip. Below 26 degrees Celsius. Speech no longer self-directed. Was this simply medical notation, or observation of something deeper? Without the missing pages, theories multiply. Without full archives, gaps widen. Walking the abandoned hallways decades later, investigators found thick frost still lining broken tiles. Wires dangled from ceiling hooks. Screw holes in the floor hinted at machines once anchored deeply. It's as if the room exhaled absence, and absence tells its own story. Nothing about these records resembles a closed project. There were threads left hanging, incomplete experiment sets, partially filled tables. Scientists don't abandon data mid-series unless forced or ordered. What disturbed archivists most were the signatures, or rather the lack of them. Pages that should list attending physicians instead ended with initials. Some signed with department stamps, not names. Accountability dissolved. Meanwhile, missing personnel rosters hint at transfers, some to unmarked facilities, others nowhere traceable. And when agents tried to reconstruct the full chain of command, they hit the same pattern: vanished supervisors, reassigned engineers, emptied drawers. The deeper one digs, the colder the trail becomes. Today, humanitarian organizations debate whether the surviving data, horrific as its origin is, should be used to save lives. Medical ethics boards warn against it. Military code survival manuals quietly reference temperature thresholds that match Dachau. Findings, but no one will say how they learned them. And below those layers lurks the unsettling possibility that we are missing more than pages. We are missing entire objectives. Why test cognition under freezing temperatures? Why require secrecy beyond wartime panic? Why remove pages that detail device specifications? It suggests experiments existed parallel to the official narrative, perhaps seeking something we still do not understand. The archives that survive are a map, not to conspiracy, but to absence. The holes shape the outline of something larger. A researcher once described it perfectly. Between what we know and what they removed is the real story. And somewhere in that missing space, the cold chamber becomes more than a tool. It becomes a question mark, faint, frostbitten, and unanswered. Because this was never only about how bodies freeze. It was about what happens to the human mind when everything warm is stripped away. When Allied forces stormed the heart of Germany's scientific network, they expected to find nothing more than abandoned laboratories and scattered instruments. Instead, they stepped into a quiet disappearance. Shelves that should have held years of research were stripped bare. Cabinets were empty, except for the ghost outlines of removed binders. It was as if someone had departed only minutes earlier, taking only the pieces that mattered. Investigators quickly learned the cold exposure trials were not the work of a single physician, but a network. Paper trails led to university professors, aviation engineers, and military medics, embedded deep within the regime's infrastructure. Their signatures appear on lab requests, but vanish from later pages. Entire identities dissolve mid-record. As war tribunals assembled, some personnel were captured and questioned. Their testimonies were fractured. Selective memory, missing dates, vague descriptions of orders from above. When pressed for more, they answered with silence or fear. Others, strangely prepared, presented cooperation as currency. They offered data, techniques, and insights in exchange for asylum, and nations listened. The United States initiated Operation Paperclip, quietly collecting German scientists and relocating them into programs that would shape aerospace, medicine, and Cold War research. The Soviet Union executed similar recruitment drives inside Berlin's wreckage. Laboratories that once served the Reich now powered rockets, aeronautics divisions, and early cryophysiology studies across new borders. Files once marked Geheim and secret were reclassified, then buried deeper under new headings. Names were altered. Employment histories were rewritten. Scientists who should have faced accountability instead received badges, housing, and fresh funding. Meanwhile, at Dachau, the physical environment changed. The cold chambers were dismantled piece by piece. Metal rings bolted to concrete vanished. Gauges and pressure instruments disappeared into crates. Even the test tanks, large enough to submerge bodies, were hauled away by trucks with no insignia. Locals recalled engines idling long after midnight. Surviving subjects struggled to testify. Hypothermia clouds memory. The brain protects itself by forgetting. Many could recall only fragments: the sting of ice water, the sharp crack of a thermometer probe, the blur of a clipboard moving in and out of focus. Names of doctors were foggy, voices indistinct. Trauma does not archive cleanly, but records hint at something unsettling. Flight logs from April 1945 reference private aircraft departing small airfields near key research sites. Destinations were listed only as transfer. Passenger manifests were never released. Witnesses described nervous groups boarding under guard, carrying only metal cases and sealed folders. One intelligence officer later wrote, "We arrived days late. Whoever left was left prepared." Decades passed. From dusty archives and forgotten boxes emerged glimpses, diary pages, blurred photographs of machinery, letters referencing parallel facilities beneath the Bavarian mountains. These were not rumors. Allied reconnaissance documented ventilation shafts carved into rock. Underground tunnels appeared on aerial surveys, then disappeared under official redaction. Were the cold chambers replicated elsewhere, or expanded into something beyond survival science, into revival, suspended biology, or cognitive manipulation under cold stress? Historians disagree. Officials refuse comment. A former technician, interviewed quietly in the 1970s, described gel cooling protocols in a facility he would not name. He spoke of subjects monitored for brainwave activity until readings nearly flatlined. He insisted the trials ended before irreversible damage, but then paused. His expression suggested doubt. Another document surfaced from an anonymous source, detailing rewarming Series D. Unlike earlier trials, this set tracked neurological reflexes post-revival. Hours of cognitive testing followed rewarming. Subjects were asked to repeat sequences, solve puzzles, identify shapes. Their results were compared against baseline personality markers. None of this aligns with air-sea rescue. This is behavioral profiling, and again the pages abruptly end. When researchers revisit the archives today, they discover access restrictions that seem unnecessarily tight. Why would decades-old medical data remain classified? What possible risk could it pose? Unless perhaps the experiments continued elsewhere, adapted, improved, hidden under modern research programs. Cold exposure data has applications in deep-sea operations, high-altitude aviation, emergency medicine, even early ideas resembling modern hypothermic surgery. The fragments we have suggest continuity. The fragments missing suggest direction. Meanwhile, several scientists who escaped tribunal vanished fully. No employment records, no public addresses, no graves. Intelligence agencies list them as unresolved. Some speculate relocation into corporate research divisions. Others suspect new identities in foreign states. The truth is scattered, like pages torn from a book. At abandoned mountain facilities, rusted signs warn of contamination. Steel doors remain sealed beneath layers of welded plating. Locals whisper of humming sounds beneath the ground long after the war, before authorities arrive to bury entrances under rock and concrete. Explorers once drilled near a suspected vault, only to hit reinforced metal, deeper than expected. The government denied knowledge, yet official maps show blank zones, square kilometers, labeled simply as training reserve, no detail, no topography, just white space. Archivists note that missing records are patterned, not random. Entire sections on cognitive decline under cold stress are absent. Pages referencing prototype heating devices are removed. Meanwhile, mundane logs, storage, maintenance, uniform supply remain untouched. Someone chose precisely what to take, not because the truth is unknown, but because the truth is known to someone else. Today, families of survivors press for full declassification. Human rights groups argue for transparency. But the doors remain sealed, letters are returned, requests are denied for national security considerations. The phrase chills more than the cold chambers ever could, because secrecy suggests relevance. Relevance suggests usefulness, and usefulness suggests continuation. And in those missing pages, missing names, and missing laboratories, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. Some knowledge does not disappear. It relocates. For decades, the cold exposure files remained sealed behind concrete walls, buried in indexes labeled only by numeric codes. Historians assumed the archive would never open. But in the late 1990s, under political pressure and shifting international policy, portions of these medical records were quietly declassified. Not announced, not celebrated, simply released into reading rooms where only a handful of authorized researchers could pry them open. Inside, investigators found page after page of temperature curves charted with frightening precision. Recovery times measured to the second. Notes on cognitive deterioration written in neat clinical handwriting. These were not chaotic wartime scribbles. They were structured studies. Hypothermia thresholds, rewarming gradients, neurological reflex timelines, technical insights that, disturbingly, aligned with modern medical understanding. Doctors today acknowledge the accuracy of the data, and emergency protocols for cold water rescues still reference some of the physiological markers described here. But no one disputes the cost. Every data point represents a life reduced to an observation. The files were supposed to be complete. They weren't. Retired analysts described courier shipments, crates of paper and rolls of microfilm, moved across military facilities in the 1950s and 60s. Inventories do not match. Some shipments were signed out of archives, but never signed in anywhere else. Others were misfiled under unrelated programs. The paper trail fractures like ice. Among the boxes that resurfaced, new discrepancies appeared. Certain warming techniques documented in early trials had notes scribbled over them, instructing future researchers to refer to auxiliary studies. Those studies are nowhere in the archive. Entire subjects disappear from mid-series evaluations. There are blank spaces where signatures should be. Anomalous heating devices are referenced, then never mentioned again. Even more unsettling are documents dated years after the Dachau chambers were dismantled. Letters addressed to military medical divisions discuss continuing refinement of rapid rewarming methodologies. One envelope bears a postage stamp from 1948, 3 years after liberation. Another from 1951. They suggest a quiet continuation under new leadership. The archivist who discovered them claimed he reported his findings and was told to stop asking questions. Meanwhile, curious reels of footage emerged from a facility decommissioned in the early 2000s. Grainy video shows archival rooms stacked with crates branded HLKO, High-Level Klassifizierte Objekte, objects requiring exceptional clearance. On those crates, serial codes match shipments that vanished from original Dachau inventories. How did they travel? Who approved the transfer? When interviewed decades later, retired logistics officers spoke carefully. They recalled orders to protect scientific continuity during the early Cold War, to preserve anything that could offer advantage. Words like medical salvage appear in internal memos, a cold euphemism for experimental data. But there is more. In the mid-1980s, a whistleblower smuggled out a fragment of a memo referencing neurological stabilization under cryogenic stress. That term didn't exist in 1942. Someone, somewhere, had continued to build on the original trials with vocabulary and theory developed long after the war. Requests for clarification were denied. Freedom of information petitions flooded government agencies in the early 2000s. The responses were polite, formal, and empty. Hundreds of pages were returned with black bars obscuring entire paragraphs. Page counts didn't match table indexes. The redaction blocks were thick enough to hide entire research arms. One line remained untouched. Certain methodologies have potential national security relevance. That phrase triggered alarm among historians. Its legal use implies ongoing applicability, meaning the data is still valuable today. Where would such relevance apply? Hypothermic surgery, spaceflight metabolic reduction, deep-sea operations, emergency rescue protocols, experimental suspended biology. In each domain, body temperature becomes a doorway, and doorways often lead somewhere. Whenever news outlets attempt to investigate, spokespeople respond that the files are archival anomalies, nothing more. But anomalies rarely travel across continents in private shipments. They rarely appear in envelopes decades after programs officially end. They rarely require vault-level restriction, which brings us to the vaults. Deep inside modern archive centers are doors reinforced with cold steel, their surfaces etched with serial numbers instead of words. Shelves inside stretch into darkness, lined with boxes wrapped in polymer film to resist decay. Some crates hold mundane medical reports, nutritional studies, altitude physiology tests. Others are sealed completely, unopened since the 1940s. Archivists are told not to pry. When questioned about crates stamped HLKO, administrators reply that special clearance is required. When asked what that clearance involves, the answer is external authorization. External authorization means the vault is linked to an organization outside public record. One former document technician recalls a file folder with a handwritten label. Rewarming Psychology, Phase 3. Phase 3? No Phase 1 or 2 exists in the archive. That technician later resigned and refused further interview. The more investigators dig, the more the ground seems to shift. Scholars believe some of the missing research now sits in private defense repositories, protected by multinational agreements. Others suspect relocation into corporations that specialize in medical device development, cryogenic storage, and trauma response technologies. These companies decline comment, citing intellectual property. International tribunals requested full disclosure twice, both times denied. Official justification. Release may compromise ongoing research activity. That line suggests continuation, not closure. Every sealed envelope, every missing crate, every signature that stops in mid-ink points to the same conclusion. The cold chamber legacy did not simply freeze in time, it thawed. It traveled. It evolved. And somewhere behind steel doors and classification stamps, pages still exist. Pages no tribunal, historian, or family has been permitted to read. Those pages hold answers, and answers are dangerous. As the sealed vault doors close behind the archived files, the modern world finds itself confronting a difficult question. What becomes of knowledge born from suffering? The cold exposure documents resurfaced quietly, but their influence did not stop at the edge of a library shelf. Over the decades, fragments of their findings appeared subtly in civilian research, in medical journals, naval rescue manuals, and aviation emergency guidelines. Not openly cited but unmistakable in pattern. Today, when a patient's heart stops, doctors sometimes cool the brain to preserve it. Controlled hypothermia can limit neurological damage. The concept is standard in certain trauma wards, its effectiveness proven. Yet when historians trace the origin story of some early rewarming techniques, they find references that vanish into ambiguous military papers from the late 1940s. Scientific boards insist the data was replicated ethically afterward in controlled environments. And perhaps it was. But the shadows of origin linger. Polar survival training, once a niche discipline, expanded dramatically during the Cold War. Pilots stationed near the Arctic learned to function in temperatures that would be fatal without preparation. Naval units drilled emergency warming protocols. Every step was presented as humane, clinical, necessary, and yet behind each lesson stood a silent equation, the limits of the human body, calculated in decades prior. Medical ethicists argue fiercely that citing these wartime findings crosses a moral boundary, as though the experiments themselves become retroactively justified. Hospitals worldwide now use rewarming gradients that mirror curves found in those brittle archival pages. Some institutions refuse to reference them, even indirectly. Others accept the data quietly, believing the knowledge is already out in the world. Then there are the darker theories, whispered, rarely documented. Some allege that rapid rewarming methods developed late in the war may have resurfaced in experimental pilot programs, allowing soldiers to recover faster after exposure in extreme environments. Others claim classified agencies explored cold endurance for high-altitude operatives, creating protocols to function in freezing conditions beyond natural limits. These theories often stretch thin. Evidence is scattered at best. Official agencies dismiss them outright. But where archives remain sealed, imagination expands. Silence breeds myth. One particularly persistent rumor suggests there were attempts to induce a kind of controlled stasis, slowing metabolism dramatically through cold, then reviving the subject once temperatures rise. Modern researchers pursue similar ideas in trauma care today, though with safety as the guiding principle. Whether these concepts originated independently or drew quietly from older notes, no one will say. Conspiracy theorists push further, linking cold endurance training to aerospace research, deep-sea biology, even cryogenic development. Most claims collapse under scrutiny. They rely on dramatic leaps rather than evidence. Yet investigators acknowledge that some key scientists involved in hypothermia studies later resurfaced in positions related to extreme environment physiology. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the unanswered question remains. What happened to the portions of the archive still sealed behind classification stamps? When files are withheld, the mind fills them. Real historians argue something simpler and more unsettling. The true legacy of these trials is not hidden technology or secret endurance programs. It is the demonstration that science, when unbound by ethics, can drift into cruelty without noticing the moment the line was crossed. The cold chambers were not built to explore possibility. They were built because urgency convinced rational minds that subjects were expendable. The data is precise, elegant, useful. The cost is written between the lines. Modern ethics boards exist because of these lessons. Every clinical trial is now overseen by committees, reviewed by specialists, monitored by law. Consent is documented. Safety is paramount. If the body cools, the heart rate is tracked. If a threshold is reached, intervention occurs instantly. Where Dachau documented collapse, modern medicine prevents it. And yet in specialized labs across the globe, researchers still ask, how cold is too cold? How long can neurons survive without oxygen if temperature drops? How quickly can blood be warmed without damaging tissue? The same questions, different circumstances, different values. As technology advances, new frontiers appear. Suspended metabolism, chilled organ transport, preservation techniques for spaceflight emergencies. Each carries echoes of earlier research, filtered through ethics rather than power. But the shadow remains. We revisit these experiments not to sensationalize them, nor to legitimize their findings, but because history warns us, urgency can justify anything when accountability dissolves. Once secrecy enters a laboratory, oversight leaves. Science is powerful. It can extend life, preserve memory, reverse trauma. But without ethics, it becomes extraction, converting human beings into numbers on a clipboard. Some ask whether we should use knowledge obtained this way. Others argue ignoring life-saving insights compounds the tragedy. There is no easy answer. In public forums, officials repeat that there is nothing more to disclose, yet when pressed about the missing shipments, sealed envelopes and vanished signatures, Their tone tightens. They reference national security. They reference medical confidentiality. They reference protocols that no visitor may read. So the theories continue. Are fragments of these studies quietly integrated into survival handbooks? Did Cold War agencies adopt techniques to protect pilots in freezing seas? Did global militaries share data behind closed doors? The more complete the archive becomes, the more gaps appear. And in those gaps, humanity confronts a reflection of what it becomes when urgency outweighs empathy. There are no glowing devices or impossible engines here. No legends of gravity-bending machines. Only steel tanks, chilled water, stopwatch timers, and the sound of pencil on paper. Reality is colder than myth. What echoes today is not the technology. It is the boundary, the invisible threshold where progress becomes cruelty, and every modern lab operating near that boundary feels the chill of history at its back. As we close this file, the cold chamber at Dachau remains more than a room sealed in steel and frost. It stands as a reminder of what happens when curiosity loses its anchor, when progress is measured without compassion. On faded diagrams and brittle pages, every measurement looks clean, objective, controlled. But beneath each neat line was a pulse, a story. A life. Investigators who reviewed the remaining documents often remarked at how the handwriting began steady, then weakened over time, as if the experiment slowly eroded not only the subjects but those who recorded them. The halls of the facility were once busy with footsteps, instructions, and the mechanical rhythm of pumps. Today, in the memories of those who visited long after, they recall something else, the hush of absence. Each data point, core temperature, heartbeat, time to collapse, was once attached to someone who might have become a parent, an artist, a teacher, someone who might have laughed with friends or walked through spring markets. Instead, they became annotations in margins and variables in equations. That is the true weight of these chambers. Not the cold air that froze the lungs, but the moment bureaucratic language replaced human identity. Science did not kill them. Ambition without conscience did. At the heart of every ethical code written after the war lies the unspoken admission that something broke here, not just bodies, but boundaries. When medical schools teach consent today, when clinical trials are reviewed by committees, when oversight panels debate risk, echoes of these chambers are present in every cautionary word. Survivors spoke of the cold as something alive, creeping beneath the skin and whispering surrender. Some recalled voices urging them to hold on, while others remembered silence swallowing their final thoughts. For decades, that silence spread into locked archives, sealed testimonies, and unnamed graves. When investigators walked the abandoned halls, long after the machinery had been dismantled, frost still clung to the pipes. The bulbs above flickered weakly, as if reluctant to illuminate what lingered in shadow. The walls held no screams, but the quiet felt heavy, as though the building itself remembered. In cramped storage rooms, file folders rested in stacks, thin as dried leaves. Some contained only numbers without names. Others had stains time refused to erase. Drafts of reports showed revisions, crossed-out phrases softened into clinical tone. Even cruelty can be edited to appear neutral. One archivist described finding a drawer labeled simply anomalies. Inside, loose pages listed subjects who did not respond as expected. Their conditions were not investigated further. They were categorized as outliers. In science, outliers are removed from results. In these chambers, outliers were removed from existence. Some secrets were never meant to be found. But some must be remembered. Not to dwell, but to ensure the world recognizes the warning carved into history by ice and indifference. The legacy of these rooms is not found in techniques, nor in medical advancements debated by scholars. It lives in the promise that no discovery is worth the cost of another human being's dignity. It's in the understanding that data without consent is a theft, not a contribution, and that suffering recorded in ink cannot be balanced by benefit measured decades later. When the doors of the cold chamber swung shut for the final time, the metal groaned softly. Investigators swore they felt the temperature drop, though the machinery had been silent for years. They stood still, listening. And in that quiet, they recognized a truth. History's most chilling lessons are not the ones we read aloud. They are the ones we feel when the lights begin to dim. As this file closes, imagine the charts, the clipboards, the thermometers settling into dust. Imagine the frost retreating, slowly, cautiously, as if unsure it is allowed to leave. Imagine the cold chamber's door sealing itself, not to hide what happened, but to mark the end of it. Because remembrance is not about reopening wounds. It is about guarding the scars. And yet, even with archives unsealed and testimonies published, questions remain in the blank spaces. Not every page survived. Not every witness spoke. Somewhere, locked behind stamped folders, threads of truth still wait in the dark. The world may never see them. Perhaps it shouldn't. But we acknowledge the weight of what they likely contain. Some secrets were never meant to be found. But some must be remembered, to ensure they are never repeated. They called it research. History calls it something else. If you want to see what else was hidden in the shadows of the Third Reich, stay subscribed. The next file opens soon.